In September, over 1,400 deaths had been recorded. For 2 weeks, burials had amounted to more than 70 a day. Then came the new moon. At first, October showed the same average of 70, but on Monday the 7th, 82 were buried. On Tuesday, the 8th, 90. On Wednesday, the total passed 100. On Friday, October 11th, it reached 119. The worst of the plague had arrived. The dusty stillness of the streets was frightening by day, for along those empty ways the poisoned miasmata stole about, creeping invisible through doors and even walls, seeking the bowels of every living thing. Here and there lay the rotting bodies of dead cats, destroyed, people supposed, by the same pervading morbidity in the atmosphere that destroyed all life. But nights were far worse. The melancholy silence of the nights in which rode the pale silver of the new October moon. Through the awful loneliness of night, the Reverend J. Henry C. Helmuth of the German congregation trudged with a trembling heart, going from one victim to another, raising fearful din in the silent city as he lifted a door knocker, radiating saintly calm as he entered a sick room, facilitating many a passage into eternity. Down streets empty as a wasted desert, past boarded shops and closed houses. For 2 and 3 dark squares he would meet no human being, hear no sound but the doleful creaking of the dead cart as it went its ceaseless rounds. In the morning, doors slammed and windows closed as a coffin went by, accompanied only by the inviter and a sexton. In one block of Apple Tree Alley, Parson Helmuth counted nearly 40 dead. But tragedy among the living was more affecting even than death. Cries, shrieks, and lamentations greeted him as he entered a house. People found release in Helmuth's gentle presence. They wept, they fainted, and between times they bespoke of him coffins and graves for their sick. Such haste to be rid of suffering human beings, such unseemly beforehandedness in arrangements of death, shocked Dr. Helmuth. He was learning much about the human mind. Madness, he observed, was common, among the well as much as among the stricken. So that is an excerpt from J.H. Powell's Bring Out Your Dead. And this was a really fantastic read. The year is 1793. The city is Philadelphia in Pennsylvania in the United States, capital of the new nation, the United States of America. George Washington is president, John Adams is vice president, and roughly 50,000 people live in the city of Philadelphia. And in the city of Philadelphia, dreadful, awful yellow fever raises its ugly head and begins killing people en masse, infecting and killing. And there are all these doctors in the city of Philadelphia, including Dr. Benjamin Rush, who signed the Declaration of Independence. And this is how the people of Philadelphia, the doctors of Philadelphia, and the United States dealt with this outbreak of yellow fever in the early days of the new nation. And it's just a really tremendous read. So it's from 1949. This edition is from 1963 or 64, I believe. And it's got an illustration on the back there too. So it's a little bit dated. It uses some outdated terminology and things like that. But it was just really a fantastic read. Just this creeping dread of yellow fever, which is a virus spread by mosquitoes, and a really, really awful virus. It's also called the black vomit. And I'll read for you the symptoms of yellow fever. It begins with chills and pains in the head, back, and limbs. Temperature rises rapidly to a great height. Bowels are costive, urine scanty and albuminous. This lasts a few days. Then the fever declines, and sometimes the patient appears to have recovered. But a remission follows, after which temperature rises again. The victim turns yellow, throws up a stale blood, black in color. Hemorrhages occur in the intestinal mucous membrane. Last comes a typhoid state, marked by stupor and hebitude, dry brown tongue, rapid feeble pulse, incontinent feces and urine, rapid wasting. From the external symptoms, the disease takes its common names, the yellow fever or the black vomit. The patient's appearance is ghastly, the stink of the sick room overpowering. So like I said, we focus on Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was the first person to diagnose yellow fever in Philadelphia. And he comes to believe, by reading an older book about a previous outbreak of yellow fever, that the way to treat yellow fever is to purge people's bowels and bleed them. And the thing is, those don't work at all. They actually make it much worse and much harder for people to survive yellow fever. But Rush came to believe in it so greatly that whenever any other doctor would disagree with them, he would become paranoid that they were working in a secret cabal to discredit him. And he had himself suffered from yellow fever a couple of times during this outbreak, and he just got worse and worse in this paranoid belief that everyone was against him, when really they were only trying to save people. And they knew that, well, they didn't know in the way that we would know in the modern time, but they knew that his methods were not really working. And he would say awful things about them, get in arguments with them, discredit their treatments, even though we have, with benefit of hindsight, we can see that more of the other doctor's patients lived than Benjamin Rush's patients lived. And it's a novel, or not a novel, it's not a novel, it's nonfiction, it's an actual history about how the people of Philadelphia dealt with this illness, how they dealt with fear and their beliefs of where it came from. They didn't understand that mosquitoes carried the virus. They believed that it was carried on the air through foul odors. At one point, they blamed it on a huge pile of rotting coffee beans. And Philadelphia, Pennsylvania had been stricken by drought, so there was a lot of standing water in streams and that kind of thing. And the people of Philadelphia dug holes full of water, and they would put their refuse and dead animals and things in the holes, and the mosquitoes would, of course, breed in those holes. And just a really, really interesting look at this time period and in the medical beliefs of the 18th century, and how really the yellow fever in Philadelphia brought the United States government to a standstill, because the senators and the president did not want to return to Philadelphia during this time. And the common people who rose up out of obscurity to take control of this situation, merchants, tailors, carpenters, to build a hospital, well, really to take over a big mansion and turn it into a hospital, to bury the dead, and to care for people who had been suffering throughout this with poverty and that kind of thing, children, orphan children. It's a really good book. And I'll read one more excerpt, just a description of how Benjamin Rush was treating his patients, if I can find it here. Between the 8th and 15th of September, Rush saw and prescribed for 100 to 120 patients a day. His pupils each saw 20 to 30 more. They had to refuse 50 or 60 calls a day. Even while they ate, patients were admitted, interviewed, the mercury and bleedings prescribed. "We lead a camp or wilderness life," Rush wrote. They gave up meats and wine, existed wholly on broth, milk, and vegetables, drank nothing but water. Fisher and Cox were both yellow and feverish, but they treated their complaints with as much indifference as a common cold. The house was saturated with infection. Soon Rush and his pupils gave up even elementary precautions. They threw away their vinegar rags, and when there were not enough bowls for his pupils to use, the young men would take patients out to the front yard on Walnut Street and bleed them as they stood in the open air. The blood flowed freely on the ground, dried and putrefied there, stank hideously, drew flies and mosquitoes. From this source, Rush observed, streams of miasmata were constantly poured into my house and conveyed into my body by the air during every hour of the day and night. By September 12th, Rush began to tire. He was sleeping only 3 or 4 hours a night. His sleep was restless, interrupted by profuse sweats. These sweats were so offensive as to oblige me to draw the bedclothes close to my neck to defend myself from their smell. He gave up broth, whereupon the offensive fador of the sweats disappeared, but still he could not sleep. When it was evening, I wished for morning, and when it was morning, the prospect of the labors of the day, at which I often shuddered, caused me to wish for the return of evening. So that is J.H. Powell's Bring Out Your Dead. And like I said, it's from 1949. It uses some outdated terminology and that kind of thing. Still just a really good book, a really, really interesting look at this moment in American history that's largely been forgotten. And this was not the only outbreak of yellow fever. There were several more in Philadelphia over the next decade. There were a couple in New Orleans. So yeah, that's Bring Out Your Dead, and it's a really good book, and you might like it, so check it out. The next book I read was Veil by Bob Woodward. This is his book about the CIA of the 1980s, which was run by William Casey, who was Ronald Reagan's campaign manager in his first election campaign, and sort of how Casey came into the CIA. He had been in the OSS in World War II. He wasn't unfamiliar with how intelligence works or how it worked in the 40s. But he was used to a more proactive form of intelligence work than what he found at the CIA in 1981, which he was very bothered by what he saw at the CIA in 1981. There was a sense of caution and timidity on the part of the people running the CIA at that time. After in the 70s, there had been Watergate and also scandals from Vietnam and that sort of thing, the Phoenix Project, or the Phoenix program in Vietnam, and some of the illegal things that the CIA had gotten up to in the 60s and 70s and 50s. And there had been a big stink about all that. So the people who ran the CIA, the presidents, had become rather timid about using the CIA. And it had fallen into kind of a lackluster performance. It was the people who were doing these operations were too cautious to really take a serious part in what they were trying to achieve, so a lot of their operations were failing. So William Casey came in, and he was the kind of guy who saw Soviets behind every bush and rock and blade of grass, basically. And he wanted to expand operations. He wanted to be more proactive. He wanted to get things done, basically, which really the CIA is not supposed to get things done. It's supposed to gather intelligence, really. And this is a study of how Casey came to start his own operations around the world, how it led to the Iran-Contra affair. And now you're not going to get very much of actual on-the-ground operations in this book. That's not the purpose of this book. It's really exploring how Casey dealt with the other intelligence communities, the oversight committees, the bureaucracy of intelligence, and how he was often able to get Ronald Reagan to greenlight his ideas. and put them into practice. Um, he was very afraid that if El Salvador and Nicaragua fell to communists, he really wholeheartedly believed that it was the Soviets who were up to no good in Central America, even though there really wasn't a lot of evidence for that. He thought that the if Nicaragua and El Salvador fell to communism, then he had this sort of overblown belief that Mexico was on the verge of collapse and revolution, and he felt for sure that it would be funded by the Nicaraguan communists and the Soviets and become a Soviet state right on our border. So he went to work trying to fund the Contras in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And it's a pretty complex thing that was going on. They got to a point where they were selling weapons illegally to Iran and using that money to buy weapons to send to the Contras, basically, which this was not supposed to happen. Congress had put a ban on this. And so it was a secret war. It was William Casey's secret war. And um, so this is not the most exciting book in the world. It is about bureaucracy. It is about the different positions in these intelligence services and sort of their infighting, their own personal ideas of how these things should be run. There's a lot of committee work in this. There's a lot of William Casey going up before committees and talking. There's a lot of the narcissism of senators on display, for instance, and that sort of thing. Barry Goldwater features very heavily in this. And sort of Ronald Reagan's sort of naive, idealistic beliefs that allowed him to just go along with other people's ideas. If it sounded good, let's do it, that kind of thing. I enjoyed it, but it's not the most exciting book in the world, clearly. Um, like I said, if you're not into reading about bureaucracy and how things are done through different channels, you're really not going to enjoy this book. Like I said, the operations on the ground are not focused on really at all. And it's an interesting look too at the role of intelligence in American government and who has the right to do what, and sort of the edge between doing too little because you're afraid and doing way too much because you're willing to take risks. And it is interesting to see how William Casey came into this, and he started getting a lot of intelligence. He started getting a lot done, but he went too far. He went into, he started to break the law. That's as simple as I can put it. William Casey started to break the law. He started to circumvent congressional oversight. And he died in 1987. He was a really interesting guy, though. He had been a venture capitalist. He had been in the OSS. He had been involved in politics for 40 years at this point. He'd made a lot of money. He invested a lot of money in a lot of different things, some that paid off, some that didn't. And you don't ever really get the sense that he was a bad guy. I'm not sure. I don't think he was a bad guy. I think that he felt that if somebody wasn't proactive, then the communists were going to take over the world, basically, and he didn't want that to happen. So he felt that any sort of means he could use was fair game for him. And yeah, it's just a really interesting book. I probably haven't done a very good job of explaining it, but it is a hard book to explain because there is so much information in it. There are probably over 100 individuals referred to throughout it, and it takes place over 6 years. And it's kind of interesting because Woodward, I'm not sure what he's up to these days, but at the time he was the journalist for the Washington Post. Famously, he had been involved in um, the revelations of Watergate with Carl Bernstein and All the President's Men. Pretty sure that was the name of that book. And Woodward had conversations with these people. He had conversations with all these different people. And during the time these things were going on, he was planning to write a book about the CIA. So he was interviewing William Casey. And just just an interesting book. It's not for everybody, but I thought it was pretty good. I think, to be honest, most people would find it pretty boring, and there are some boring parts. It's 500 pages long, and at about page 400, my attention started to wane, and I started to think, okay, can we wrap this up, please? But it is, it's an interesting look at what was going on with Ronald Reagan, with William Casey, with Barry Goldwater, and Oliver North, and all that kind of thing. I probably didn't retain very much information from it, but I'm glad I read it. So that is Veil by Bob Woodward. And that brings us to the end of this video. And I hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.